Hi guys, and welcome to another how to play video on my channel. My name is Lone Vic, and today I'll be showing you how to play Zoo New York by Uwe Rosenberg. This is a game for 1 to 5 players in which you'll be populating your zoo with new enclosures, breeding new animals, and racing to, well, create the most complete zoo before the other players. I will tell you how to set up this game, how to play a multiplayer game, and how to play a solo player game in this very video. So without further ado, let's take a look at what's inside the box and start with the setup for a 2-player game. Okay, so first things first, you have to take this, well, pretty weirdly shaped board and place it in the middle of the table in easy access for all the players. Next, in the box, you will find a pretty big collection of player boards, and you have to select the ones that are appropriate for your player count. You do this by looking at the lower left corner here, where you have this number of meeples shown. So this is for 4 players, and watch out because they're double-sided. On the other side you can have, for example, a 2-player setup. So I'm choosing this one for the 2-player setup, and also have to locate the other one for a 2-player game, and it's also here. All right, so you place them in front of each player, and the order of play will always be determined by the number in the lower right corner of those player boards. So here is player 1 and here is player 2. Next, you should take the tray with the animals, which is in the box. There are quite a lot of the animals there. There is a white fox, there is a penguin, there is a meerkat, there's a flamingo, and there's a kangaroo. And they can be all mixed up, it doesn't really matter. There is one gray elephant in the mix, which you should put here on this area marked with a red dot. This is the starting area for the elephant. And he'll be traveling along this track all over all those fields, around and around, and you'll be performing actions based on where he lands. Now, you should look at the top corners of your player boards and take the 2 appropriate animals that are shown, and be careful because on all player boards those animals can be different. So for example, for the first player in a 2-player game, this is a meerkat and a flamingo, and for the second player it's a meerkat and a kangaroo. So I've put those animals into what's called buildings, and you have 3 buildings here in a 2-player game. This number can vary as well depending on the number of players. Sometimes you have 2 buildings, sometimes you can have 3. And also this is the space in which you'll be building your zoo, and this space can also be smaller because of some water or greenery spaces. But the player who wins is the player who first completes the entire grid with domino tiles, with those polyomino tiles, sorry, with enclosures and attractions. So depending on the number of players, those areas might be smaller or bigger. For a 2-player game, this area is, as you can see, full. Okay, next you should take all of these attraction tiles in different shapes and sizes and place them somewhere nearby for all the players to have them in easy reach. I'll just put them on the side somewhere so that they don't, roam around on the screen, but you'll know they are there. You will have to take some of those tiles during the game. Last but not least, we have 4 colors of polyomino tiles with different shapes and sizes of enclosures. Different colors refer to different sizes, and then the lightest green is are enclosures that are 4 fields large, and the darker you go, the larger the enclosures are. The darkest green enclosures are with 7 spaces to fill with animals. And you should place those enclosures in these gaps between the other fields on the track as randomly as you can. So let us start with the lightest green enclosures, which, as you can see, have 4 spaces only, and you place them here in these areas where you have this lightest green tiny square shown. So not everywhere, mind you, right? So I will place one randomly here and one randomly here. One goes here, one goes here. There is one, one, and there you go. Okay, so the light greens are done. Now you should look for the enclosures with a bit darker shade of green, which are with 5 spaces, like so, and you should place one of each in each gap. If you are placing them in the same gap as the light green ones, you're placing them on top. So I will just do it like so. And mind you, this is also an area, so there should be a tile here. Next is the time for the even darker green 6 field tiles, and you place ones on top of each previously placed tile, like so. And finally, we take the darkest green tiles, which have 7 fields, and we place them in all areas where you have only 2 tiles placed right now, or if you prefer to look at it that way, the areas with the largest and darkest square in those fields. So one goes here, one goes here, one here, one here. We're missing one here, here, and here. And that's the setup complete. You are now ready to play the game of Zoo New York. Okay, welcome back guys. So now we have a game set up for 2 players, because we've got those meeples with 2 meeples in the left corner. We've got the numbers of players, so this is player 1 and this is player 2 in the lower right corner. We've got the animals set up according to the images in the top corners of the player boards. We've got all the polyomino tiles set up here. The elephant is on the red area, the attractions are here to the side, the animals are here on the top. You might not see them, I might just move them here, might be better. Next to the board so that everybody can get them, and you can start playing a 2-player game. Now let's talk about the main concepts of the game and how the game flows. I will repeat this one more time. The winning condition for this game is the first player to fill the entire brown area, the whole grid on their player board, with polyomino tiles, whether it be those enclosure tiles or the attraction tiles, wins the game. And how do you do that? Well, you move the elephant around the board in player order and you perform different actions. You place enclosures from the board into your zoo, or you breed or place animals into your zoo, trying to make it grow. So the elephant will be always moving clockwise around the board, and it will be moving across fields, across spaces. And what constitutes a space is the first idea. A space is this blue area with animals printed on it, and a space is an area where any tiles are still present. So if, for example, all players have collected all of the tiles from this, then this doesn't count as an area, and if the elephant has to move 2 spaces, it won't move 1, 2, but it will move 1 and then 2. So this is the first concept that you have to remember. And here on the player boards, you have the information of how many areas the elephant moves in a game for this number of players. So for a 2-player game, the elephant can be moved 1, 2, 3, or 4 areas during your turn. But for example, in a larger player count, the elephant will be moving 1, 2, or 3 spaces only. So it depends. Check out this information in the corner of your player board after you've set up the game. Also, what this graphic shows you is that this brown area with this protruding end is not a space where the elephant stops. The elephant jumps over this space, thus triggering something called breeding, but we will get to that later. So there are 2 types of spaces, the blue ones and the Tetris block filled ones. Okay, so let's hypothetically start with the game with the first player moving the elephant, and the first player wants to move the elephant only 1 space over here in order to collect an enclosure, because this is, well, the best logical start for the game usually. And now there are a few rules for placing the enclosure. Now, you have to place your enclosure so that it is entirely within the borders of your zoo. You can't, for example, place it like this or like this, right? If you are placing an additional enclosure, it can't overlap any existing enclosures. It has to be, fitting in the spaces next to, but you can also place additional enclosures in a completely random different corner of the zoo if you want. It doesn't have to touch any of the pre-existing enclosures. The second condition for placing an enclosure is that you have to have an animal present in your zoo that you can put into this enclosure. So you can't take an enclosure from the board, place it here, and just leave it empty. It has to be immediately filled with something. So what you can fill it with? you can either take one animal from any of the buildings that you have occupied right now. So I could take, for example, this meerkat and place it in the enclosure, right? And remember, you have only 3 buildings, so you can have only 3 animals in those buildings at any time. And an enclosure holds only one type of animal, so I wouldn't be able to put this flamingo here as well. So I've placed a meerkat here, and that's okay. In a situation where you have more enclosures and you have more animals, so if we had a situation, for example, like this, I had, let's say, 2 kangaroos already here, right? In this enclosure, I had 2 kangaroos, and I would be adding a new enclosure to the mix. So I will be placing this one. Then I would be able to place a meerkat or the flamingo from the building into the enclosure, or I would be able to move one of the kangaroos here into this enclosure, but you cannot empty another enclosure while doing that. So if I have 2, I can only move 1. If I had 3, I could move 2 of those animals into the new enclosure, and that's basically it. Okay, but let's reset that. So I've collected this one enclosure, I've placed the meerkat here. Another thing is that you can't take an enclosure if you don't have a legal space to put it, so if it doesn't fit anywhere in your zoo, you cannot collect an enclosure, so you have to have room for it. And there is also an additional rule for placing animals in enclosures, but I will get to that later as to not overwhelm you with too much information for now. So okay, this is the end of the first player's movement. He moved the elephant once, he took an enclosure, and he placed the meerkat into the enclosure. Now it's time for player 2, and player 2 also needs an enclosure right now, but player 2 is going to go 1, 2, and 3 for this enclosure. It's a pretty long one, so let's put it, for example, here. And he will also move a meerkat from the pavilion, from the building, over here. All right, now we've crossed one of those brown spaces with the elephant while doing this, and this would mean that this animal that's printed on this brown space would have a breeding turn. So this would be for the white fox, but none of the players has a white fox in their zoo right now, so this breeding is obsolete. We won't be doing anything with that. Okay, so it's back to player 1, and player 1 right now says, okay, so I've got one enclosure, I would like to have more meerkats in my enclosure, so I will move 1 here, and I will take both of those animals that are printed here, so a kangaroo and a meerkat, and I can place them in my zoo. So let's take a kangaroo, let's take a meerkat, and now I don't have any places to put the kangaroo in the zoo, because I've got only one enclosure with a meerkat, so the kangaroo goes into an empty building. But I can place the meerkat in this. I could place the meerkat in the building as well. Why not? But I will place the meerkat here in the enclosure to have a pair of meerkats in the enclosure, right? So here is what the first player does right now. And the second player goes, well, okay, I think I'll be copying your movement because this is tactically pretty okay. So I will move the elephant 1, 2, and take a meerkat and a flamingo. So here we go. So the flamingo, again, has to go into the building, and the meerkat can go into the enclosure, and that's it. So this is the function of the second field, of this second area. This is collecting new animals, right? So you can take one or both of those animals that are printed here, provided that you have room in the zoo for it, either in the buildings or in the enclosures, and you place them there. And that's it. And now we are, as you can see, getting close to this breeding space with the meerkats, and this is the last thing that can be done in this game. So if the first player, for example, right now does this, so moves only 1 and says, okay, I want a new enclosure tactically, let's slow down this breeding, right? So I will take this new enclosure, I will place it here because it fits so snugly in, and I will place one flamingo here in this enclosure, and then that's okay. And then the second, he could also split the meerkats, but that doesn't make sense. You will see why in just a moment. And then the second player goes, okay, I have no other choice. I will trigger the breeding because I have to move the elephant at least once. The elephant can't stay in the same place for the player's turn. But the second player says, okay, so I will go 1, 2, 3, and I will take this enclosure because it fits my zoo better. And the second player has to finish his movement first, so he will be placing the enclosure, and you can flip it around and everything. So he says, okay, I'll place it here, and I will put a kangaroo here. I won't split the meerkats as well. And the second player says, okay, now I've triggered the breeding of meerkats. And what happens now is that the player who triggered the breeding of meerkats checks his zoo first, and he checks whether he has any enclosure filled with at least 2 meerkats. If there is only 1 meerkat in an enclosure, breeding doesn't happen because, well, an animal can't breed with itself. But if the player has 2 meerkats, then it's okay, so I can breed an additional meerkat into this enclosure because I've got a pair. But that doesn't mean that if you have 4 meerkats, you can breed twice. So you could breed, like, 2 meerkats into the enclosure. No matter how many meerkats you have, no matter how many animals you have in an enclosure, you always add 1 when it comes to breeding, right? So if I had 3 here and it was breeding, I would just add 1. Again, if I had 4, I would just add 1 during the breeding. But you can do that in 2 enclosures containing at least 2 meerkats. This is what this graphic says. 1 or 2 enclosures can breed additional animals, right? So if you have 2 or 3 or more in this enclosure, you can add 1 animal when the breeding is triggered. So this player finished his breeding, and then the second player also can breed 1 meerkat because he has 2 in this enclosure as well, right? But in a 2-player game and in a 3-player game, there is one additional rule for this breeding, and this is this bracket that's printed here. And this says that once you breed in at least 1 enclosure during a triggered breeding, you can breed in an additional enclosure of any type, with any type of animal, right? So for example, if the situation for the second player was like so, and the meerkat breeding was triggered, he goes, okay, so I have 1 meerkat enclosure that can breed, and he would do this, right? And then, since he had at least 1 breeding by the meerkats triggered, he says, okay, I've got 2 kangaroos here as well, so I can breed 1 more kangaroo and place it here, right? So you can add 1 additional animal to any pair of animals in an enclosure if you bred at least 1 of the designated pair that triggered the breeding. So this is this rule, and it's for 2 and 3 player games. 4 and 5 players do not have this rule, right? But let's leave it at that for now. So this is reset. And here right now I can talk also about this graphic, which is the last rule that you have to remember about, which says that whenever you add an animal into an enclosure, whether it's from collecting animals and placing them in an enclosure or through breeding, you add a new animal, you can also add 1 animal from a building into the same enclosure. Only 1, not more, only 1 animal into the enclosure, right? So for example, if the second player, again, let's do it with the second player, had 1 meerkat in an enclosure for some reason, right? And he had 2 here, and the breeding triggered for meerkats, he would go, okay, so I can breed those 2 and add 1 additional one, and because I've added a new meerkat into an enclosure, I can move 1 from a pavilion into the same enclosure as well. And that's how the turns go and go and go and go, right? So let's reiterate for that. You can collect a new enclosure, place it if you have room for it, and you can populate it with at least 1 animal, either from a building or another enclosure, without emptying the enclosure from which you are taking animals. And remember that when you are populating the new enclosure, you can add 1 or 2 animals into the enclosure. You can't put 3 animals into a freshly taken enclosure. It's only 1 or 2, no matter where are they from. You can also take the space with collecting new animals and add them to existing enclosures or buildings. And when you trigger the breeding, you breed in 1 or 2 enclosures which have at least a pair of animals in them. And if it's a 2 or 3 player game, you have 1 additional breeding if you've bred successfully in any designated enclosure. And that's basically it. So now those enclosures will be slowly filling up, right? And what happens once an enclosure fills up completely? Let's do another hypothetical here using player 2. So player 2 has, let's say, something like this right now, right? And let's say that the elephant is crossing the board again, and the move triggers another meerkat breeding. We'll breed meerkats only in this example. So the first player who, for example, moved the elephant would be the first one to breed, and he says, I've got 3 meerkats here, so I would breed an additional 1, and that's groovy, thank you, right? But the second player goes, okay, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 meerkats here, so it's more than a pair, so I can breed one, and I can move one from any building into this enclosure, and that fills my enclosure. Now, at any moment any player fills an enclosure, the game stops for a moment, because immediately once you fill the enclosure, you have to empty it from all animals. You can keep one of them in a building if you want and if you have room, and the enclosure is now empty, so you will be able to fill it with new animals once you collect new animals, for example, right? But you can't right now move any additional animals from any enclosures. And once you've emptied an enclosure, you are able to take an attraction and place it anywhere in the park, in your zoo, sorry. So this is how you can additionally fill the spaces, and this is very important because attractions are the only tiles which are in those pretty easy shapes, like for example lines and single spaces, which you will need sooner or later to complete your park before all the other players do. So this is the last thing that you do, and you do it every single time you fill in an enclosure. So you fill this one and you take an attraction, and then you check if you filled another one and then take an attraction, and if you're done, the other player checks if they filled, and so forth and so on. So you have to do it step by step. Why is it so important to do it step by step? Because let's go for another hypothetical here. No, I don't need a kangaroo. I need, for example, something like this. So if the second player had a setup like this, right? And let's get those meerkats back here to the original setup. It's like a very meerkat heavy game. I like those animals. They're cool. And it's like pretty cute. And I don't mean the Lion King ones, I mean the real thing. This is the setup for the second player right now, right, with the meerkats. And he says, okay, and the meerkat breeding is triggered. So he says, okay, so I can breed one meerkat here, for example, because I've got 3. So I will add this here, and then I will move one from the pavilion, thus filling this enclosure. So I have to clean it, right? Because now the game pauses and he has to clean this enclosure of his, and I will keep this one in the pavilion, and he takes an attraction because he filled an enclosure, and then he goes, okay, so now I'm filling the second one and I'm breeding one, and I'm taking this one from the pavilion again, and he empties this enclosure again because the game stops. He keeps this one in the pavilion and he takes a second attraction and he places it, for example, here, right? So doing it step by step and player by player is very important. Step by step, I've shown you right now why, because you can manipulate those animals that you get back to the buildings from filling in the pavilions. But also step by step is important because the player who triggered the breeding is the first one to breed and do all of those operations, and then it goes to the other player, because there are a limited number of those large tiles and, for example, those L-shaped tiles in the attractions, and sometimes order might matter because we might steal something that somebody else needs or something like that. So be wary that it goes, player by player from the one who triggered it and then clockwise, right? Okay, cool. So after somebody fills in all of those spaces with attractions and or enclosures, he says, I'm the winner, and that's it. Immediately the game ends, and that's done. We're done. You've built the best zoo. Okay, so this is it for a multiplayer game of New York Zoo. I will also mention one thing, that if you want a 2-player game played shorter when it comes to game time, you have an option to set it up a bit differently, and I will very quickly clean the house here to show you the setup for a quicker 2-player game. And after this, I will show you the rules for the solo mode. So if you're not interested in solo mode, then you can already tune out, but if you are interested, please bear with me, right? So I will just return those tiles here for a moment, because I will need to show you something here, and this one goes here, and where do I have the 2? Okay, here, and the elephant goes here. So now the setup is complete for a normal game, and if you want a shorter 2-player game, you should take one Tetris from one polyomino from the top of each stack, so that there are only 2 polyominoes in each stack. Like so. And you should give each player randomly 3 7 spaces, so 7 field spaces, enclosures, sorry, so the dark green ones, and 3 lighter ones, which have 6 spaces, and return the overflow to the box, because there will always be an overflow. And the players start with those enclosures placed in their zoos already, right? So, for example, let's quickly set it up like so. It will be probably very tricky to fill this zoo in. And remember about the animals as well, because the starting animals are here in the pavilions too. So this would be a starting point for a quicker 2-player game. Only 2 polyominoes in each stack. The largest ones go 3 dark ones and 3 lighter ones, so 3 7 spaced and 3 6 spaced for each player, so that they can fill in their zoo as a starting position. Okay, so this is the end of the multiplayer explanation. If you're not interested in the solo mode, thank you very much for watching. My name is Lone Vic. This was New York Zoo by Uwe Rosenberg. And if you liked the video, you liked the explanation, click the like button under the video, leave a comment, click the subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and see you in any of my new videos, or even the old ones that I have on my channel. Hope you like them all. If you, however, want to see how the solo mode is played, stay with me for another 5 or a bit more minutes while I clean this up again. Okay guys, so here we are back again for the solo mode of Zoo New York, or New York Zoo, however you prefer to name it. And for a solo play, you need this board with only 1 meeple here, 1 player, and it's 2-sided, so you can choose that you want a shorter game, which has this area switched off and the area that you have to build up is smaller, or the larger area for gameplay. I'll choose the smaller one for this show, but it doesn't matter, we won't be doing this like a complete playthrough. And you also need those squares with numbers that you can find in the box, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4+. When you set up the game, you only set up the 2 bottom polyominoes, so each stack should have the 2 lowest numbers shown, so there will be no 7 spaces enclosures, and there will be very few 6s, and the elephant goes back here, and you start with the animals shown in the corner of your player board in the buildings as well. Alright, so those are the changes in the setup of the game. Now when it comes to the rules, the rule with the additional breeding is also present in a 1-player game if you've watched the previous parts of my video. So once you breed an animal in any of the enclosures designated by the breeding area, you can breed 1 additional animal in any other enclosure as well, where you have at least a pair of animals. And what are the basic changes? So the elephant will be moving a number of areas designated by 1 of those tokens, or by 1 more decision, basically. So once you decide where you want the animal to move, you can take the token and flip it the other side up. So each token can be used only once, and once you flip all of the tokens face down, you flip them all back up. So, you know, you will be going round and round through those. So an elephant can move 0 spaces. So unlike a multiplayer game, you can trigger the space that the elephant is standing on right now, for example, even. You can move 1 space, 2, 3, or at least 4 spaces. So, well, if you're left only with this token, you can only move the elephant 4 spaces or more, and that's it. The additional movement rule is that you can move the elephant without using any of those tokens, but then the elephant moves to the next nearest animal acquisition space, omitting everything in between, but also triggers the breedings if the elephant manages to cross 1, right? So those are the 2 options for movement. And you play by the normal rules, adding enclosures, putting in animals. You can't use a token if the movement that you would make with this token is illegal for some reason. So for example, if you had to move by 1 and you can't add this enclosure anywhere because it doesn't fit or you don't have any animals, to place in the new enclosure. You wouldn't be able to use a token like that, so you would have to be forced to move to the closest animal acquisition space probably, or use another token if it's available. The game ends once the elephant circumnavigates the board twice. So that's the first one, and then if he goes the second time, the game ends. And now, if at this point you don't have the zoo filled in completely with all of the spaces, well, you lose the game. Sorry, you have to try again and you have to get better. But if before the elephant circumnavigates the board, you manage to, for example, here on the second round, you manage to complete the whole board, you win the game, and you score 1 point for each area, for each place that the elephant is from reaching the finish line for the second time. So in this case I would get like 2 points, 2 measly points, but at least that's something, right? So the faster you do it while navigating the board, if the elephant, for example, ends here, you would get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 points. So that would be a great game, and you have to try and beat your own score. And that's it. That's the only change that you have in the solo game. So you decide the movements using the tokens, and if you don't want to use up a token, you can move to the closest animal acquisition space, and you have to complete the zoo before the elephant circumnavigates, crosses the finish line or the starting line, call it what you want, twice. And if you manage to, you win the game. So that's the solo mode, and thank you very much. My name is Lone Vic. This is New York Zoo, or Zoo New York, from Uwe Rosenberg, a polyomino placing tile, a puzzle game for 1 to 5 players, and this was the solo rules explanation as well as the previous multiplayer explanations and setup explanations in this video. If you like the video, click the like button, hit the subscribe, ring the notification bell, leave a comment, check out all the other videos on my channel. And for now, this is all. Stay safe, play board games. See you in another of my videos very, very soon. Thank you very much. Bye bye.